Welcome back to the Manage to Win podcast. Glad to have you here. We've got a good conversation coming up, something that's going to maybe surprise you, maybe you question yourself. And before I get into that, please don't forget our sponsor, Habitly.com, where you can learn the soft skills of highly successful people. You need to learn these things. Get those habits going. Take your strong habits, make them superpowers. Take your weak ones and address them. Make them so they don't hurt you. Habitly.com, 7 days free. You can't go wrong. Our guest today is Tracy Crossley. Now, she's not just a coach or a mentor type of thing. She's a behavioral expert, author, podcast host, and she focuses on freedom from attachment. That's one of her podcasts with over 600 episodes. It's even more than us. We're just over 250 or so. And she has another podcast she started, which is called The Power of Me, Creating Meaningful Success. And she's doing some really cool stuff that helps us overcome that negativity committee in our brain, but also helps us engage with people on our team who have some attachment issues also. And by the way, almost everybody has some level of attachment issues. It's a great conversation. It goes really fast. We talked for 30 minutes. It felt like 5. And I literally could talk for her for hours more. Found it very fascinating. Hope you enjoy it too. Let's dive in. Tracy, you are focused on attachment with leaders and dealing with attachment so we can be the best we can be. I have 8 kids, 5 of which are adopted. And so I've had a lot of talk, study, work with trauma. I learned more about my own. But where do you want to start this? Because this sounds like there's a lot of Americans and people worldwide who need to understand more in this area because we can be kind of clueless. I was clueless until my 50s. So hopefully everybody else can get started working on their stuff a lot earlier.
Well, it's interesting because I think we're always looking for what's either going to make us a more effective leader, what's going to make us happier as a human being. I think that most of us are seeking that. I shouldn't say most of us, some of us are seeking that. Not everybody is, but when it comes to attachment, insecure attachment comes from attachment theory. Attachment theory was developed in the late 1960s by a psychologist named Dr. John Bowlby. And he was studying infants and how they came into this world. And if we came in and we, babies, how we were looking to have our needs met. And so what's interesting is that through attachment theory, it became really clear that there was also insecure attachment. And so insecure attachment, meaning either you had a parent who was inconsistent, like one minute they'd be loving, the next minute they would not be. Others that were more, let's say, avoidant and wouldn't, give any kind of love and maybe not even feed you regularly or, take you out of your dirty diapers regularly. And of course, this would escalate as you got older from being a baby to 2 years old, 5 years old, so on and so forth. But what it did was it established our worldview of how are my needs met or how are my needs not met. And we become attached to things outside of us, meaning relationships outside of us, that somehow that's going to fulfill us. And we don't learn about self-worth. We don't learn, any of these things in childhood. And so it all sort of developed from there. And there's been different iterations of the theory and different iterations of attachment styles. But I have found that in working with leaders and working just with individuals too, that either people are anxious avoidant, or just avoidant. And what that means is emotional intimacy is an issue. And that means how you bond with other people, how close you allow other people to get to you. A lot of times we don't let people get that close to us. Even, as a leader, you want people to understand you and want them to follow your lead. But it's really difficult when you're giving mixed signals or you have no empathy or you have trouble with empathy. So, I can keep going on, but does that give you an idea?
Yeah, but there's so much there. And of course, with working with kids in foster care and being aware of reactive attachment disorder and how that applies with them. And then what you're further suggesting, which I've had some thoughts on, but not really thought deeply about, is how this affects people who just aren't in the foster care system. I mean, I've thought about it mainly with whether it's kids I've adopted or other people that I've met who've had traumatic growing up experiences, whether they were foster kids adopted or whether it was just in their family.
Yeah.
You know, where they had a parent who just ripped into them.
Right.
You're the problem. Or at least that was the message they received, and however that was done. And I'm wondering what type of story or explanation you want to give to kind of further set the stage for how this affects many people or most people.
Sure.
But then I really would like to get to, before we're done today, what are some steps that somebody can take to start that journey? Because I'm sure it's not like turning on off a light bulb. Okay, I'm done. I'm healthy now. But to really try to be on a path of healing and to understand that, I'm going to have some days where I take 2 steps forward. I'm going to have some moments, not days, hopefully, moments where I'm going to take a step back, but it's still okay. I'm on a journey of healing. So where do you want to go, Chief?
Well, I mean, there's so many different places I can go, but going back to what you were saying about trauma in childhood. So, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I would say that what's interesting about that, it's not always that you had trauma in your childhood years, although people who've had trauma absolutely have insecure attachment. It's just to the degree of what other mental issues they might have along with that too, because, you're talking that just can exacerbate anything. But when it comes to people who have had overprotective parents, they also can have insecure attachment issues. When you have, you have a parent who has their own issues. And so, sometimes they're loving and sometimes they're distant, right? So it's not necessarily trauma, but it's not, knowing that mom or dad is always available to you. And there's parents where they did everything, but there was like no emotional closeness whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
So this trains you that you have to do things to get love. You have to do things to get attention. You have to do things to be approved of.
Performance-based love.
Right. It is performance-based love. Absolutely. And so that's what ends up happening. I know a lot of leaders are driven by their childhood wounds because the conditioning was, I always have to perform. And if I stop performing, nobody's going to care. I'm not going to be validated. I may as well be nothing. Like your self-worth is dependent on everything external to you. And that's the problem because we miss the whole internal aspect. And one thing I will say, like in the work that I do, is most people that have insecure attachment live in their head. And the reason being is when you're a child and you've gone through a lot of pain and you realize that you're not just unconditionally loved just because you're there, that you're feeling that love, right? And seeing it in action. And that makes you want to not feel the pain. And so what we tend to do is we tend to strategize. We start doing this, at a young age. We start to strategize unconsciously. You're not consciously aware you're strategizing like, what shall I do today? But you're living in your head. And so we are disconnected from our bodies because our body will feel pain. Our body is where the emotions live. And so oftentimes we're cut off from that. And that creates a bigger issue, especially as you get older and you realize a lot of your decisions are made from the pain you think about and the fear you have of feeling anything. And therefore, a lot of your decisions reflect that.
But and I don't want to speak out of turn, but my understanding is that a lot of us have what one guy I met called the negativity committee in his brain, where when it's in our head, it's not one voice putting us down. It's like a horde of demons, just beating us up. Particularly when we have that one step back, we make a mistake and we go into self-hatred and we go into, I'll never get this. I'm a loser. I'm whatever the messaging happens to be. Does everybody have that, or is it in varying degrees, or is it just some of us?
I'm laughing. So there was a study that was done, and I think it was saying like 40% of the population doesn't have any voice in their head, which I thought was really interesting because I haven't met that 40%.
I haven't either.
Never. And I haven't met them. Ever.
No.
So
Yeah.
the degree that you have an inner critic usually means, let's say you had a critical parent, we embody that. We take that information in and we become an even bigger jerk in our head. So, whatever you were criticized for as a kid, you're just that lives in your head. That's your ego. Your ego is always coming from fear. It's always trying to, control what you do. And unfortunately, when you listen to it, you tend to keep making the same kind of decisions over and over and over, which you might feel you're stuck at times. You might feel you keep running across the same circumstances. And that's because the ego is a survival mechanism, right? We have the, part of our brain, the amygdala, that has all of our history, your subconscious. It keeps, everything that's fear-based. There's a saber-toothed tiger outside. I better be careful because it ate dad for lunch yesterday. So I better stay in. And that's the kind of thing that we react to and we probably forget about. And then it gets in there, and your ego, when you're talking about that inner critic, that voice, it's reminding you of everything you need to be afraid of, how you need to be perfect or you're not going to have love or attention, or how you need to keep performing. Like it's like the worst coach you could have in your head, right? Like I'm thinking if you're a football team, like you have this voice, like you're doing a horrible job. You need to get back out there and, do whatever. But it's really keeping you very limited.
That brings up two things. I hope I can remember the second one as we move on. But so I'm a follower of Christ, so that's my faith. And then there are other faiths where, and so I'm not trying to promote my own, just using it as a reference point. So there are other faiths where, we're kind of trained to try to move away from the ego and try to use the sounding board of whatever that faith is to get more direction in life. Do you find that some people have success in doing that? And if so, why, versus just dealing with the ego or trying to manage it a different way?
So I'll just share with you, the work that I do is really about removing things like the inner critic, that voice in your head.
Yeah.
And it's about getting past these attachments. And what I do is emotional work in your, and getting at the deeper roots of what causes it, and then changing how you believe and the things you react to and so on and so forth. And I bring that up because of what you just said. And what I have found is it makes it also part of your spiritual journey, not necessarily your religious journey, because they can go together, but not for everybody. And it's more of a spiritual journey because it opens you up in ways that you're not open. Because a lot of times we don't realize how much our ego controls, even how much we allow in, let's say God, universe, whatever it is you believe, how much we allow in. But when you start removing those obstacles, you have more space for it and you have a better connection to it. And I feel that people expand, not just spiritually, but you do physically, emotionally, mentally, like you expand in every way possible. And what I mean by expand is you stop allowing certain things to limit your life.
So what happens with someone who, basically they were raised that they were not good enough? That's a very common one.
Yeah.
Not good enough, or even worse, you're the problem. So not good enough is more, hey, that was great, but if you did this, it would have been better. But the you're the problem type of thing. And so they make a mistake, and then that inner critic, that negativity committee just starts beating them up, exaggerating, making them live in the past of something they cannot change. You're not good. You're not worthy. Maybe something worse. You need, you should die, whatever, blah, 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 blah. So how does somebody combat that? I mean, you brought up athletes before. Athletes typically, although they may be driven by an unhealthy motivation, we could talk about specific athletes or entertainers or anybody who's celebrity, quote unquote,
right,
who has some unhealthy motivation. But they typically have an I can type of trigger that will kick in, that'll kind of block out, that other piece. But what about this person that doesn't have that ability, which may not be healthy in itself because it's not dealing with the root? Where do you go? What do you do? Because you're just getting beat up.
what do you do about your inner critic? Or
Yeah. What do you do about that inner critic that's exaggerating, trying to get you stay in the past, say you'll never get beyond this, you'll never be any good? How do you deal with that?
I mean, there's several different ways to deal with that. Number one is that when you you don't want to struggle with it. So first of all, you want to stop arguing, which means a lot of us, what we'll do is we hear a negativity and then we'll try and say something positive. No, I'm not, I'm this, or whatever. You get in an argument in your head and you have to stop the argument. You just need to, first of all, just say okay to it. The more you say okay to this voice, all right, it starts to get quieter because you're no longer giving it fuel by keeping an argument going with it. Because the truth is, on some level, you believe what that negative inner critic is saying. And the more you argue with it, the more it just remains a fixture in your life. So that's just.
But also, doesn't that inner critic always operate from a partial truth?
That's what I'm saying.
Partially true. I mean, it's like they say evil's greatest lies are based on a partial truth.
Well, so partial truth in terms of your perspective, not a truth in reality. Reality is most of our heads, if somebody heard all the stuff in our heads that was standing outside of us, your husband, your wife, your friend, they would go, "Are you kidding? You're not any of those things," right? So it comes from your beliefs. You have negative core beliefs that, and that's, again, what we work with in the work I do, because for me, when I started my business, I wanted to get past a lot of this stuff. And that's what I was able to do. And the reason being is when you stop, first of all, struggling with yourself, okay, you got to start there. That's like step one. Then what you have is you have something called emotional space, which means that I can now start to feel the feelings that I'm normally avoiding. So a lot of times we will notice things like I'm crying, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. Those are all reactions, okay? All reactive feelings to things that are happening outside or a story in our head. You wanted to say something? Yes.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm just trying to keep my thoughts together. So because I'm already thinking what I want to ask you next, but I don't want to interrupt.
Okay. Well, I just, I don't want to keep talking if you've got something important.
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay. Awesome. So anyways, what happens is when you have an inner critic, first of all, you got to be aware, okay, I'm hearing that voice. Okay. Thank the voice. It's trying to protect me because it is trying to protect you. As silly as it sounds, it's trying to protect you by keeping your life that small and controllable. Because again, this negative voice isn't there just for fun. It's not created just for the heck of it. It's a safety mechanism that reminds you, hey, you have to keep doing this. Otherwise, you're not going to get paid, or you're not going to get attention, or you're going to lose that client, or, something like that. Right. And so oftentimes what we end up doing is we put too much belief in the inner critic because we have a negative belief that says, like you did, I'm not good enough, or I'm not okay in some way, I'm bad, blah, blah, blah. So then when you feel your feelings, which I won't get into that because it's quite long, and listening to it is one thing, but learning it is another thing. And then you have to take what I call emotionally risky action, which means that the emotions you started to feel and that you've gotten deeper with, that there's a certain vulnerability that comes, and you have to do the things that there's another voice inside of you tells you to do. So and I shouldn't say it's a voice. There's always a feeling inside of us of the thing that would be good for us to do, whatever our next step is.
Okay.
We've come to ignore that because it doesn't feel safe, because our ego, this inner critic voice, is more trustworthy to us because it's more familiar, because it's louder, and because your brain likes familiarity. It likes to know this is the norm. The other voice may feel, and again, it doesn't really come across as a voice. It can just come across as a feeling, like, I need to do that. And a lot of times we ignore it. But when you start paying attention to it and you start living by that, you change your whole life. You become free of these things.
But as you're indicating, doesn't the negativity committee, whatever, and it become a habit? It's almost like a comfort level. I think you've alluded to that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I am a loser, or I made that mistake. I'm never going to get it right. So And that was going to be my next question, which you kind of indicated, but maybe I'm wording it incorrectly, is that I find that when I'm under attack, that one of the best things I can do is, and I didn't realize I was doing it, I'm just speaking candidly.
Yeah.
I do kind of acknowledge, I made the mistake. But then what I do is I then force myself, and it's not super hard for me, but I force myself to go do something else. So it's like, the negativity committee wants me to focus straight ahead, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to the right. And I go work out, or I go finish, a 15-minute, 30-minute, hour-long task or whatever. So I take my brain off the subject the negativity committee wants to keep pounding me on. Is that unhealthy?
It just prolongs whatever it is you're doing because it doesn't go away that way. It still keeps coming back. My goal was to not have it come back anymore. My goal was, because because to me, I thought this is conditioning, right? I wasn't born this way. So anything that you've been conditioned to, you can undo. And that was the goal with what work I do. And that is, if I was in a position where somebody was arguing with me and telling me, let's say, things about myself, and I can go, okay, sure, that's right. But the thing is, I stay with it. And instead of coming back with an answer to somebody of, putting them down or arguing with them or defending myself, what I instead do is I try to pay attention to what reactions I'm having in my body, because you're having emotional reactions in your body. That's where your emotions live. They don't live in your head. They live in your body. If I'm paying attention to what's happening inside of me, I can get to what the root is of why that feels true, or why somebody is seeing something in me that has some truth to it. Oh, wow. I've always felt like, as an example, oh, wow, there's that I feel like I'm wrong. And I can go back in time and go, oh, of course, when I was 7 years old, this happened. I'm kind of giving you like a short version of what I'm talking about, by the way.
Yeah.
But, you go, okay, so if I were to reframe it, and you reframe it, like in the work we do, we reframe these things. Anyways, long story short, what you're doing is you're finding truth in yourself. Well, what's really the truth? The truth is that this was an event that happened that I allowed me to take on as an identity, which isn't part of my identity. Me being wrong isn't part of my identity, but I took it on. So what can I do right now that would feel like an emotionally risky action? And that might be to be vulnerable and say something that's very vulnerable. It might be just me allowing the emotions to flow through my body and not try to stop them or distract myself from them. Which is basically what we're supposed to do. Like, you start to feel better when you do that. You start not having so much tension or anxiety. And then what is it that I can do now with staying in the moment, not disappearing and going off into the future or distracting myself? It's, what can I do right now with something that I feel like I want to run from, or I feel like I'm, being, beaten up from. And so it's really about sticking with it, because you're an adult now. See, the thing is, when you have a little kid's body, you can only handle so much. As an adult, we can handle a lot more. But unfortunately, our emotional maturity taps out at like 5 years old when we don't have any sort of reinforcement for self-worth. So again, I'm talking in a lot of words, and I want to give, a lot of context, but it's difficult without losing everybody as I'm talking, because there's so much there. Like, I have so much I can say, but I can drown you out in a lot of information.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, I'm going to stay in the moment and try to understand what's going on, and then think about what I want to do that's emotionally uncomfortable. I have two questions. One, is part of the process that I want to consider where the other person's coming from. So are they coming from a sincere place? Are they coming from a wound themselves? Not in a defensive mechanism, but in a just to interpret the data that I'm getting from this person. Are they communicating this with my best interests at heart, or are they trying to hurt me? And then go to where's the truth in this? Because there's probably some truth. And what piece is truth and what piece is exaggerated or not true? Is that any part of the process?
Not really. And I'll tell you why. Because other people aren't what creates change in us. Other people, just because they see something or they have a problem with you, okay, does that make you change? No, it does not make you change. And if they're coming from a place of wanting to hurt you versus they're thinking that they're connecting with you, then, what you have to look at is the state of the relationship rather than it's two different things is what I'm trying to say. So
Right.
One thing is, the state of your relationship here. Is this a relationship that I'm really connecting in or am I disconnected in? And then the other part is it doesn't really matter if they're right or they're wrong. It matters how you're feeling and what you're going to do about it for yourself. Because to me, the more you grow your self-worth, the more you grow as a human, okay, your relationships change anyway. And your ability to speak to things, let's say that you always leave dishes in the sink or something, okay? And it drives, your partner nuts, okay? So if you leave dishes in the sink all the time, and then let's say I'm the partner and, I feel like, okay, I will say to you, hey, you know what? The dishes are here. What can we do about this? Like, I know for you, this isn't a top priority. And for me, it is a top priority. It doesn't make, the other person wrong. It's just they have a different way of living than you do, right? Yeah. So, and a lot of times we don't do that, right? We don't allow that. We want it my way. It's got to be my way. No, it doesn't have to be your way. It can be both of your ways. You've got to just look at, you might be a little inconvenienced if it's important to you. Okay, you know what? It's important to me. So how about this? If you leave dishes in the sink, will you just leave them in a pile? Or if you leave dishes in the sink, can you let me know? And then I'll do the dishes. And then maybe that person will step up and do something you don't like to do that's important to them. But it's the point of those aren't even the problems. Those are just like the little, match to the flame. Because when you're not happy with yourself, that's what comes out in your relationships at work, at home, everywhere you go. You, especially those of us with insecure attachment, can be a chameleon, right? We can need different things from different relationships with people. And oftentimes, depending on who it is that's saying something to us, we'll take them seriously or we won't take them seriously. We'll defend ourselves, we won't defend ourselves. And none of that works because it doesn't do anything for changing what is going on inside of you.
Well, and also you're alluding to something much more significant is that the dishes in the sink is a symptom. It's not the disease. It's not
right.
Like you kind of indicated when I said, kind of I'll distract my brain. I'm not dealing with the root of the issue. Now, you mentioned that when I've got this uncomfortable situation, that I stay in it and try to do something uncomfortable. Are there ever times where it's appropriate to say, let me get back to you on that? And then I exit stage left and process things a little bit more before I do that uncomfortable emotional thing? Because if I'm just going right off the moment, isn't there a pretty good chance, or at least some chance, I might make the wrong choice as to what that uncomfortable emotional thing.
It's not something you have to actually think about. Like I was saying, there's a feeling there that's already telling you what you need to do. I'll give you an example. Like I had a disagreement a long time ago with someone, and the reason I can remember it is because it was so significant. How I would react in the past was to do something like you would do. I got to get out of here. I can't, I can't think, I can't do anything. But because I had been really working on rooting out a lot of these beliefs I had, this conversation was triggering some of those beliefs, and I could feel that urge to want to get up and go. But what I did was I really focused on the feeling in my body and what it was saying. And then I knew what I needed to say. It wasn't that I had to think about it. It's like I knew it. And I said it. And I went, I can't, and it would be something that, old me would be thinking I'd be losing the fight, right? Like, oh, I'm saying this and I cannot believe I'm even saying this. And what ends up happening, or what ended up happening in that situation, was I was able to break a pattern of behavior that never came again. So in the heat of something where you're having an emotional response, it's a great place to break a pattern that you're never going to have again. Because if you have to think about it and come back from that, you're not really going to be breaking a pattern. You break a pattern because patterns, I'll give you an example too about patterns. So when you have a pattern, it supports a belief. And you develop a belief from emotional responses you have over and over again. You don't have a belief like somebody says to you, the sky is purple. And you're looking at it and you're like, the sky's not purple, right? So you're not believing that. You don't have an emotional response to it. You may have an emotional response to something else over and over and over again. And that creates a belief. So when you start working at the level of emotional responses and what is behind that, then you start to, let's say, chisel down that belief. And then the patterns of behavior that support it, you stop doing. And to me, that was what I wanted. I didn't want to even have the reactions that I would have.
Yeah. And is that process basically the same when it's not other people who are beating you up, but just you're beating yourself up and you're doing it really, really hard?
Yeah, it is. Like you could think about those times when you feel, to me, when you feel physically heavy, like you've got a weight on your shoulders, weight on your chest, you've, your throat, you feel like you got a lump in your throat, your upset stomach. Those are signals of, doing that to yourself or you feel depressed, what have you. And you have to look at the last thing you feel like doing, but the thing, let's say, that would move you forward in those moments, right? Like, oh God, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. But it's really about, there's something you already know. Again, you already know what you need to do. But a lot of times we just get into those familiar feelings and we stay there and we don't get out of it unless, the pattern is maybe you stay there for a day and then, okay, now I'm starting to lighten up. Now I'm starting to get back to normal. And that's just that's a pattern in and of itself. So what you want is to break these patterns of behavior. And oftentimes it's when it's hard to do that, it's the best time to do it.
I'm laughing because it's been 30 minutes and I feel like we just started for about 5 minutes. We're just getting started. So Tracy, you've got a podcast, The Power of Me, Creating Meaningful Success. You're doing a lot of great stuff. You're an author. If people want to learn more about what you're doing, where do they go and learn more and gain from your expertise?
Okay. So basically, you can go to tracycrossley.com and it has everything there. I've had a podcast called Freedom from Attachment for the last 8 years. And it's all about the things I talk about. You could listen to it. You can learn, in depth more of what I'm saying. All of my programs are listed on my website, and I wrote a book that's also on my website, and it's sold at all booksellers. It's called Overcoming Insecure Attachment. And we work with businesses, we work with individuals. Really, it's about changing our relational dynamics and getting to a place of actual self-worth, not just talking about it, but actually having self-worth.
Awesome. Well, I want to encourage everybody on the podcast. If you feel like, hey, I don't have any attachment issues and I'm just fine. Okay, I'll go with that. But I would still encourage you to check out what Tracy's doing, because although you may be absolutely perfect, I guarantee you have people on your team, if not everyone on your team, and yourself, by the way, who really does have some attachment issues, large or small. And there's something to be gained here if you really, truly want to be your best and positively affect the lives of others. So Tracy, thank you so much for being on the show. Let's talk for another 4 hours after we sign off.
Thanks, David. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Tracy. You could see that I was very engaged. Please leave us a comment or a rating, subscribe. That would be great. Send this podcast to somebody else. Hey, you better listen to this. There's something there for a lot of people. Please don't forget our sponsor, Habitly.com, where you can learn the habits of highly successful people. Great things there. Set goals and achieve them. Be a better leader. Avoid conflict, resolve conflict, etc. And then also, stay tuned. Got more great guests coming, but bye for now.